He was rejected and scorned by the world, and one day he simply walked into the forest and disappeared for 42 years. Prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Mason Evans. My name is Mason Evans, and I was born in a log cabin at the base of Chiahowie Mountain in Monroe County, Tennessee, in the winter of 1824. I was one of 9 children, and from an early age, it was clear that I was different from everyone else that I grew up with. Most kids dreaded going to school for the few months that it was open each year, but me, I excelled in math, and my penmanship was the talk of our small community. I loved school, and I always looked forward to it, but most of the time you could find me exploring the forest. The mountains were still untouched, and the screeching sound of the locomotive echoing across the valleys was still decades away. The Cherokee still called this place home, and I had many friends who were Indians. They taught me to read the forest, which plants I could eat or use for medicine, how to track animals, and how to make fish traps. I spent my entire childhood roaming all of the ancient trails that had first been cut through these ridges by animals and then traveled by the Cherokee. I always kept a sketchbook with me where I drew countless pictures of wild animals who seemed to almost pose for the portraits since they had no fear of me. I spent many days drawing majestic sunrises, waterfalls, and the wild beauty of it all. And back at school, all the other kids were fascinated by these uncanny, lifelike drawings, especially a pretty girl named Dawn. Each day I came to school, she would always ask to look at my sketchbook, and she would spend the entire school day studying my pictures, and unbeknownst to her, I spent the whole day staring at her from across the room. Now, Dawn was a beautiful blonde-haired lassie with the prettiest blue eyes I'd ever seen. Her father was the only doctor in our area, and she was his pride and joy since his wife had died giving birth to his only daughter. But over the years, Dawn and I became inseparable at school and any other time that we could sneak away. My father had given me a beautiful horse, and together, Dawn and I spent much of our time at a special cave on Star Mountain that I kept secret from other people. High on a bluff overlooking the majestic white mineral springs that my Cherokee friends had shown me when I was younger. And there I drew countless portraits of Dawn as we sat outside of Panther Cave with her hair glistening in the glow of the sunset. And by the time Dawn and I were 18, there was no denying it. We were both very much in love with one another. It seemed like fate knew it too, because both of us were hired in 1843 as teachers at the same 2-room schoolhouse. Now, technically, I was the principal and she was my assistant, but we made a perfect pair. Dawn taught grammar and spelling, while I taught math, art, and penmanship. For the next few years, we grew closer and closer, until one day I couldn't wait any longer, and I asked her for her hand in marriage. I still remember how we embraced right there inside the schoolhouse, dreaming of our future together. Yet there was still one obstacle that stood in our way, and that was her father. She would never marry me without obtaining approval from him. Now, Dawn, she had frequently spoke of me to her father, but he would always reply, "Well, Mason Evans is a bright chap, but darling, you should never settle for a man without money." Other times, Dawn would mention how she admired the way I sat high in the saddle on my horse, only to be met with a stinging rebuttal from her father. He had always idolized his only child, and he had never remarried after the death of his wife. Instead, he devoted all of his affections to Dawn, who was his pride and joy. Each day, he would cheerfully kiss her as she mounted her horse to attend to her teaching duties, and each afternoon it was her father that waited at the gate of their home to help her dismount. "Your mother would be so proud of the lady you've become," he would always say, as he gently kissed her again. The truth is, Dawn was his entire world. But still, we knew we had to tell him of our engagement. "Father, I have something to tell you," she started out. "I'm in love with Mason Evans, and I'm asking for your blessing to marry him." But as those words fell upon the old man's ears, his face became washed in a ghostly white as the room fell to a deafening silence. And then he made it clear, under no circumstances would he ever allow his daughter to marry me. The next day, I received a note telling me that Dawn would no longer be teaching at the school, and furthermore, there wouldn't be any marriage, and then Dawn said she never wanted to see me again. Just like that, it was over.
Now, there comes a time in a man's life where he stands at a crossroads with a decision that will forever change the rest of his life. And for me, something snapped. I folded that letter and I left it on my desk, and then I left my horse right there at the schoolhouse, and I walked into the woods where I completely withdrew from society forever. That's right, in 1845, scorned and rejected by the woman he had dreamed of marrying his entire life, Mason Evans disappeared into the wilderness of Chihowie Mountain, where he made his new home in total isolation in Panther Cave. And remarkably, there he would remain for the next 42 years.
Now, Panther Cave is located on the west side of Star Mountain in East Tennessee, and it's here that Mason Evans lived for a staggering 42 years, roaming the forest of Monroe and McMahon counties. It wasn't Dawn's leaving that ruined Mason. It was the way she stayed in his thoughts for years after she was gone. Mason survived off of wild berries, chestnuts, roots, and herbs, and he had always been a friend to wild animals, and during all his years in solitude he never shot a single one. Heck, he didn't even own a gun to protect himself. But he wasn't above journeying down the mountain occasionally and stealing a chicken from an unsuspecting farmer. In fact, as the decades went by, many farmers began leaving scraps of food hanging in buckets on tree limbs at the edge of their farm for Mason, just high enough that the dogs couldn't reach him, but low enough that Mason could take the bucket instead of stealing one of the farmer's chickens. By 1860, a grand resort hotel was built near the cave at the site of a place called White Cliff Springs that attracted tourists from all over America who came by the thousands to bathe and drink in the mineral waters that were advertised as having healing properties. The hotel became known as the Saratoga of the South, and wealthy patrons traveled from as far away as New York and New Orleans to enjoy the mountain air during the summer months. Mason was known to venture to the edge of the woods that surrounded that hotel to spy on the tourists, and by now he had been living in the mountains for a decade and looked every bit the part of a wild man, barely wearing any clothes, with long hair and beard. He hadn't spoke to another human in so long that he would only growl and snarl when some poor soul tried to approach him. But still, the manager of the kitchen took pity on Mason and also began leaving buckets of food for him and even old newspapers. Mason would take the food and the papers back to his cave where he read of the war between the states, and from his perch he looked down at the valley below where he saw wagons traveling a newly cut road with supplies for the war, and soon there were even strangers dressed in blue and gray uniforms. But Mason, well, he always kept just out of sight, and they never discovered his cave. But once the Civil War ended, Mason's brother petitioned the county court to declare Mason insane and grant him the power of attorney over him. You see, it turns out that when Mason's parents died, they left Mason 160 acres of land, and now with power of attorney, his brother simply sold Mason's land and pocketed the cash, and then paid a group of men to capture Mason and bring him to town so they could have him committed to an insane asylum. Sure enough, Mason was captured and chained like a wild animal and brought to Athens, Tennessee, where they chained him to the floor in a local farmer's basement with chains that were originally intended for restraining the owner's slaves while the property owner slept at night. For days, Mason was held like an animal awaiting an official order from the court to commit him. Each day, sympathetic ladies from the community would bring him food, and on the fourth day they felt so much pity for him that they brought him an entire pan of cornbread. And as Mason was feasting on it, there in the middle of it was a metal file that the women had baked into the bread, which allowed him to cut the chains and escape back to Star Mountain. By the 1880s, the outside world began creeping in all around Panther Cave. Several lumber companies began buying up huge tracts of land, and then strangers armed with cross saws and axes began harvesting trees. They were hundreds and perhaps even thousands of years old, and before long the hills were echoing with the sounds of massive trees tumbling to the earth, as the sound of a locomotive screamed while it rumbled down the new railroad that was cut to haul them. And as much as this new industry began encroaching on Mason's world, it would be a news reporter from a local newspaper who caused the mountain man the most harm.
In an effort to sell papers, the reporter began a weekly series called The Wild Man of Chihauwie, creating sensational stories of the exploits of Mason Evans, who terrorized farmers and women and would attack and eat animals raw. Week after week, the stories became more bizarre until finally they were picked up by national newspapers. Suddenly, city folks from as far away as New York City were reading about the wild man whose heart had been scorned by a woman. Nearly overnight, readers of the Wild Man stories began demanding that law enforcement track Mason Evans down and jail him. And that's exactly what happened on January 9, 1886, when Mason was captured and placed in the McMahon County Jail, where hundreds of people descended on the jail to get a look at this wild man. A judge quickly declared that Mason was insane and sentenced him to be locked up at the county farm. And down at that farm, Mason was held in a cage that had a sliding door that would be open during the day to allow sunlight in. And soon, workers at the poorhouse began charging curious folks who ventured to the farm 5 cents each to look at Mason, who was now being held in a cage like a circus freak. Yet several days later, Mason Evans again escaped and ran for the shelter and the solace of Panther Cave on Star Mountain. On one quiet morning on January 11, 1992, Mason Evans was found sitting underneath a chestnut tree facing the valley that laid far below Star Mountain, and there he was found frozen to death. Scorned by the only woman he could ever love, Mason Evans simply walked away from society and chose the mountains because, as it turns out, they were the only ones that never betrayed him. For 42 years, while towns grew and railroads screamed through the valleys, Mason remained where he had always belonged, among the trees, the animals, and the old trails that were cut long before he was ever born. In the end, he didn't die in chains or in a cage, but beneath the open sky, alone, just as he had ever lived. You see, Mason Evans never feared the wilderness, because he was the wilderness itself. If you found this true story of survival and heartbreak moving, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold legends from the heart of Appalachia.